Hi, I'm Councilman Mark Cuthbertson. I'm here today with Robert Hughes, who is the historian for the town of Huntington. Welcome,
Hello.
Robert.
Thank you.
And as you know, our town has a rich history dating back to 1653, and there are things that I think historians pay a lot of attention to, whether it's the Gold Coast mansions or the American Revolution. But we're here to talk about a topic that doesn't get as much attention: the plight of enslaved people in the town of Huntington. In honor of Juneteenth, the day in history that all Americans became free, I want to talk to you about and learn about Huntington's history with enslaved people. What year do we first find records of enslaved people in the town of Huntington?
Well, it goes back to really the very beginning of the town. The town was established in 1653. And the first reference in the town records to there being an enslaved person in town is 1660 in connection with a court case. It's just a reference that one of the people involved in this dispute was an enslaved person. And then there's another record from 1666 in which a gentleman had purchased a horse, and in partial payment for the horse, he transferred his enslaved person to the seller. So we know that from the very beginning there were enslaved people here.
Any idea from those records how widespread the plight of enslaved people was?
The real first numeration of how many enslaved people there were was the slave census of 1755, when there were 84 enslaved people within the town of Huntington, enslaved within 54 households. So it's about 1 in 7 households had enslaved people, and there were 1 to 2 per household.
Now, I've heard the argument made that enslaved people, it was more humane when it came to the North than the South. Is there anything in historical record to support that?
Not really. And cruelty is cruelty, and it's hard to say that because it was smaller scale, it was less cruel than in the South. It was much larger in the South. You had the big plantations with dozens, if not hundreds, of slaves. And here it was much smaller, 1 to 2 per household. But you can sort of see the effects of enslavement. There were people, enslaved people who would self-emancipate, as we call it now, and the enslavers would post a notice in the newspaper, run away from subscriber, and it would describe the person, what they looked like. And several of them had indications that the people were scarred from burnings or scaldings when they were young, which, that could be an accident, but most likely was probably punishment for them. And the fact that they would run away indicates that it was not a humane institution. And beyond the physical pain was the emotional and psychic pain that slavery inflicted, especially when it comes to mothers of children. People really didn't think anything about separating a mother from her child. There's one letter that's in the collection of the Huntington Historical Society, which is, I find, very disturbing. Silas Wood, who was a lawyer, a member of Congress, and wrote the first history of Long Island, was asked for advice on rights to a child.
And who the school is named after in the
Yes.
South Huntington
Yes.
School District.
Yes.
Sure.
Silas Wood is a local hero, but he, as a lawyer, he was asked for his opinion. And the situation was that an enslaved woman was bound out to another person for a term of 8 years, and after which that time she would be free. During the 8-year period, she gave birth to a child. And the question was, well, who has rights to this child? You would think the mother, who is now free, should have her baby, and the baby would be free. But Silas Wood said the legal opinion is that we treat people, children born to enslaved people, the same as we do domestic animals, and that the baby is within the ownership of the person who had the enslaved mother at that time that she gave birth.
How awful.
It's incredibly cruel. I mean, there may not be any physical suffering there, but the emotional toll must have been intense.
I mean, among the ways that people chose to keep enslaved people down was to prohibit them from learning to read or write. Any context about that?
It's actually in New York. I'm not sure there was any explicit prohibition against it in the later years. And of course, the Lloyd family taught Jupiter Hammond to read and write, and he was well entrusted and became a published poet. But actually, when they started to gradually manumit enslaved people, starting in 1785, and then later in the early 19th century. Enslavers were given an incentive to teach them to read and write, because if they did not know how to read and write the scripture by the time they were 21, they were given their freedom. So if the enslaver wanted to get another 7 years of service out of a male enslaved person, they would teach them to read and write. So there was kind of a reverse incentive. It's kind of backwards in a way, because you're letting loose into the world someone who's less prepared to be free. But that was the incentive for them to be able to learn to read.
Another awful part of the legacy. Speaking of, emancipation of enslaved people, once that happened, was there any provision made to assist, to help them in their new way of life?
There were a couple of things that were done, and some of it was to help the enslaved person, and some of it was to help the enslaver. For instance, the 1785 law said you could not free an enslaved person unless they were under the age of 50, and we were able to demonstrate to the overseers of the poor that they were capable of taking care of themselves, because they didn't want it to become a public charge. If you were going to emancipate someone who was over the age of 50, you had to post a 200-pound bond, just to ensure that if they did become a public charge, there was money there to care for them. And then if you were a child, a baby, that was abandoned, is what they called it. The enslaver abandoned his rights to that child's labor. They became a charge of the overseers of the poor, but the state would reimburse the local overseers of the poor $3.50 for each child. So that was sort of a way of compensating the enslaver for freeing the child.
What an elaborate system. Obviously, it was an elaborate system to enslave people, but then also to undo this horrible process. In terms of people nowadays wanting to visit the graves of enslaved people, are there cemeteries in the town of Huntington that have such graves?
Yeah, there were hundreds of people who were enslaved, so they have to be buried somewhere.
Right.
Unfortunately, they rarely, I think if ever, had a marked grave. The old burying ground on Main Street in Huntington Village is where many of them were enslaved. And they were buried. They were probably buried with the family that enslaved them, so it was all within the same household. And interestingly, when we get to the 1820s and 30s, when they were free, they were buried in a far segregated corner of the cemetery. There's a cemetery in Cold Spring Harbor had been known as the Jones Cemetery, but we now call it the Harbor Road Burying Ground, which was always reputed to be the burying place of enslaved people. We have no documented records that that's the case, but certainly people of color were buried there throughout the 19th century. And of course, the one definite cemetery for enslaved people was on Lloyd Neck, where the Lloyd family was buried in a vault, and then the people they enslaved were buried behind them. And there are simple fieldstone markers there. But there's one large, broken up brownstone slab, which we think might be the burying ground of Jupiter Hammond.
So you mentioned before, and just mentioned again, the life of Jupiter Hammond, who's so interesting and someone for whom we dedicated a wonderful historical marker. The markers you see around town, which are blue and yellow and are terrific, and have a foundation that helps subsidize them, and you and all the people who cared so much about history help bring them together. But what more can you tell us about Jupiter Hammond?
Jupiter Hammond had an interesting and long life. He was born in 1711, which was the same year that Henry Lloyd came from Boston to the Neck and built a house which still stands on the grounds of Compset. And he spent almost his entire life enslaved to the Lloyd family. But they did teach him to read and write. He served 4 generations of the family. And during the 1760s, he was published. Joseph Lloyd managed to make arrangements to have his poems published. And there are a handful of poems that have survived, some of them only recently discovered. And he is considered the father of African American literature in the United States. A lot of people know about Phyllis Wheatley, but he actually published before Phyllis Wheatley did, including a poem called The Ode to Phyllis Wheatley. So he was aware of her. How much she was aware of him, I'm not sure. But it's an area of continuing exploration. The Joseph Lloyd House, where Jupiter lived in later years of his life, is owned by Preservation Long Island, and they have just, well, actually, they're still in the middle of a process called the Jupiter Hammond Project to reinterpret that site to give full attention to not only Jupiter's experience, but the other enslaved people there. There were over a dozen people enslaved on Lloyd Neck in the late 18th century. So it's an interesting, evolving story. He ended up getting his freedom eventually and living on West Shore Road, where we put the historical marker. And where he's buried is a little unclear, but I'm pretty confident he's up on Lloyd Neck. That's the one location that makes the most sense.
Interesting. We could go on a lot more. I appreciate you coming here today. And I think, in anticipation of Juneteenth, obviously a celebration of the emancipation of the enslaved, but important, and I thank you for giving us the ability to look back at what that institution was specifically in the town of Huntington, how cruel it could be, how wrong it was, but it's still part of our history.
Yeah, they say it's painful to remember, but too important to forget.
I like that.
Got that at the Black History Month program a few years ago.
There you go.
One of the speakers, she was
great.
Well,
Well, Robert, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and thank you, and hope you continue in all the good work that you do.
thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
The history of enslaved people here in the town of Huntington is not something about which we've talked often. I recently had Robert Hughes, who gave us a tremendous history of enslaved people in the town of Huntington. So what I'd like to talk to you both about is the history of African American people who were enslaved after they became free.
Well, one thing we can do, we can start with Jupiter Hammond, who is arguably one of the town's more famous residents. Everybody knows, or should know by now, that he lived up in Lloyd Harbor. Everybody knows that he was the first published African-American poet. But what's less talked about is that when he and other enslaved people up there were freed, they moved south to Huntington. And Jupiter Hammond, as a free man, he was freed at the age of 88 years old. He lived with his great-nephew Benjamin in a house on Wall Street. It's interesting when you look at the census, because although the home was owned by his great-nephew Benjamin, Jupiter is listed as the head of household, and that's because even as a free man, he harvested fruit in an orchard up at Lloyd Harbor. And that's how the family made money. That's how they got income. When he died, that income for the family dried up. And at some point, Benjamin ended up having to sell that house. But you can go over to West Neck Road,
Yes.
and there is a plaque outside of that salt box home, and that is where a freed Jupiter Hammond lived.
So another prominent African-American family is the Crippen family. Irene, can you tell us more about Peter Crippen and his family?
The Crippen family is part of the free African Americans in the town of Huntington. Peter Crippen, a former resident of Cold Spring Harbor, was born free in Accomack County, Virginia in 1809. He came to Huntington seeking work and in response to the Crossman Brickyard need for workers. According to Huntington Historical Society, Crossman Brickyard books indicate that Crippen worked from 1836 to 1838 at the brickyard. According to the 1850, 1860, and 1870 census, Crippen held other positions. He worked as a fisherman and other labor-related positions. At age 30, Peter Crippen is listed in the 1850 census with his wife Clarissa and 3 children, Harriet, William, and Sarah. Peter Crippen purchased the house at 61 Creek Road in 1864 from Albert and Elizabeth Waters. The house, believed to be partially built from one of the oldest grist mills in the town of Huntington, was owned by members of the Crippen family for over 160 years. Other families lived in the area as well, and it should be noted that that area was a vibrant African American community at that time, and some of those families were the Jackson family, the Alvarez family, the Woods, the Wrights.
It's amazing, and I think people lose sight of that fact, or don't know, not even lose sight, that the Creek Road area was an African American enclave in our town, and now, obviously, a bunch of things that are around there to focus people. All right, the Valencia Tavern is close by, our fields at Mill Dam, right in that area, right in the vicinity of there was this thriving community. So Joy, what else can you tell us about the Crippen House in that neighborhood?
There's been a lot going on with the Crippen House even this year. In January, there was an archaeological dig there. As I said, part of the house was a grist mill that dated back to the 1600s. They found pieces of glass, they found ceramics, they found all kinds of things that historians are hoping will give us some insight into life in that community in the 1800s. And just this week, the house was in the news again. Preservation Long Island included the Crippen House as part of its 20 most endangered places for 2021. And what's interesting is if you go down Creek Road, you can probably smell at times the sewer. I think we've all smelled that sewer. And you take a look at a house and you say, what is the significance of that house? This designation says that the condition of the house is meaningless. It is the history of the house that becomes important. It's where the house is, what they can find in the house. So that remains a very important part of Long Island's history.
So a lot of good things going on down there, and a great way to try and preserve the history of African American people in our town. Irene, let's talk about some other noteworthy Huntington residents.
Okay, some of the other noteworthy residents that we've studied over the years are Samuel and Rebecca Bolton, and they were notable active members of the Green Lawn community.
The Pickle King.
The Pickle King.
The Pickle King.
We have a festival for the Pickle King, or the
Bolton,
Pickle Festival.
A little history about Bolton. He escaped from slavery in Virginia and eventually returned and brought his wife to freedom. He served in the 5th Cavalry and was honorably discharged. As a farmer, like you just said, he was known as the Pickle King of Green Lawn. We also had Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington had a summer home in Fort Salonga. He was the founder of Tuskegee Institute, and which is currently known as Tuskegee University. And he also taught Sunday school at Bethel Church. We have Albert and Lottie Folk. They were early African American residents in Northport. They lived on Bay Avenue near the harbor, and they relocated later to Huntington Village. We have John and Alice Coltrane, well-known musical icons in the United States and abroad.
The Coltrane House has been preserved, and I recommend a visit there because you've got people at that house can tell you not just about anything you ever want to know about Coltrane. They can tell you an awful lot about Huntington's history too, and they do it in a way that's very, very engaging. Frankly, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay and have them keep talking. But you've got more.
Paul Johnson, recently deceased, was a community activist, and he also was known for his love for his church and his political and community activities.
Oh, I know. When I didn't get it right, I'd hear from Paul, Irene, that's for sure. Whether it was politics or otherwise, I heard plenty of times from Paul. So
and you weren't the only one. You weren't the only one hearing from Paul. Paul welcomed me with open arms in the community when we first moved here. And the town is named something after him as well.
Plaza over in Huntington Station. And he was obviously, among other things, a veteran. Served in the armed forces, so we miss him dearly.
Oh, yeah.
He was always on the scene and always involved, and never lacked for an opinion.
And another person we got to know was Richard Robinson. He was the first African American policeman in the town of Huntington, and also served in the armed services.
Yes, and in fact was a policeman when we had a town police force. That's, now we have the county, of course, but back then it was a town police force. And when we celebrated that many years ago, the former town clerk, Joanne Rea, had a wonderful history and celebration of that, and Mr. Robertson was included in that.
And he's also the great-great-grandson of the Picker King, Samuel Fulton.
Did not know that.
So there's a connection.
Many other sites within the town that have significance when it comes to African American history. What are some of the other sites in some of the other areas?
We had mentioned Bethel AME Church earlier, and as you know, Bethel is one of the oldest African American sites in the town of Huntington. It's located on Park Avenue. And the pastor is Reverend Larry Jennings. We also have the Evergreen Missionary Baptist Church. It's the largest African American Baptist church in the town of Huntington, and Reverend Dr. Larry Washington is the pastor of Evergreen.
Joy, we touched on some of the historical markers, but there are others and other issues of interest.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because we've talked about individual people at individual points in time. But if you take a look at it all in total, I mean, let's just take that little area where Peter Crippen is. The house where Jupiter Hammond lived as a free man, you can walk from there to Peter Crippen's house. Where Peter Crippen is, you can walk from there over to the Bethel Church. And if you look at the graveyard there, some of the founders of that church are back there, and their families are back there as well. And it gets to be a little more interesting because you can get an even broader sense of community, because if you look at the church's website, and Reverend Jennings has some of the history up there. Before the church was built, these families would meet and worship in the backyards of homes, and those homes were scattered along Wall Street. Now you think of Wall Street now, everything's on top of each other. The homes back then were kind of all spread out. So you have an African American presence in that area that we can date all the way back from Jupiter Hammond's being enslaved to him being free to the Crippen family who spent, 121 years in that home?
Well, it was part of the family for over close to 160 years.
160. That's why you're here, girl. You keep me honest. 160 years. So it shows a long and continuous presence of African Americans or African American Huntingtonians, although, we were all once part of Oyster Bay and everything, but, and it's a deep and it's a rich history. And what's interesting to me about this is when I first came here, I learned about Jupiter Hammond by reading a National Geographic. I had no idea of any of this stuff. And it's been over the past few decades because of Irene and other people in the community that we're all beginning to know more and more and more.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here. We really just scratched the surface, and so much more we could talk about. And obviously, African American History Month comes each year, and a lot of important events happen, and we reflect upon things. But I think Juneteenth now becomes a touchstone for talking about, among other things, the history of freed people in our country and in our community. Thank you.
Thank
you
for having us.